Growing up, I was obsessed with Star Wars, and that obsession has abated recently due to recent releases in the franchise, but it also meant that I had very little familiarity with Star Trek, and this is something that's continued my life so far. I still haven't really watched the TV series, and the only films that I'd seen were the recent reboot started by J.J. Abrams. With having a bit more free time recently, I thought, you know what, I should go back and watch those original Star Trek movies. So I did. I just watched the first six, the original series, and was surprised by a whole load of things. First, I was surprised by how much I really enjoyed them. My favourite is definitely the fourth one, which I just thought was terrific.
Hello, computer.
Wrath of Khan held up really, really well, and a lot of time for Star Trek 6 as well. And you know what? Star Trek 3, that sequence where they steal the Enterprise, is one of the best sequences in the franchise as a whole. However, I do have some reservations. Obviously, Star Trek 5 is a reservation.
What does God need with a starship?
That movie, because it's just not very good. But one thing that struck me about the series was the way it deals with one of its primary themes, that being equality. I want to stress that this opinion is entirely based on these six films. I have no idea how Star Trek deals with this outside of these films. First of all, the utopian vision of Star Trek is kind of awesome. It's got a lot of issues around the edges that are all explained by but not excused by who the series came from and the time period in which it was created. There are issues with race representation and gender representation, and these exist to certain extents and to large extents in places in the film franchise. I want to focus on a specific detail today, specifically the idea that the equality in Star Trek is portrayed through a very colonialist lens. Now, what I mean by this is that the root ideas of equality, what it means to be equal, are framed by a very homogenous experience, very much applying the standards of white, Western, canonical society to society as a whole. What I mean by canonical here is the idea of accepted cultural artefacts, the idea that there is a list of certain things and pieces of art that demarcate you being cultured, and that these always pull from a sphere of white, primarily British, Western culture. One of the core themes of the Star Trek narrative on a character level is Spock's dealing with being half human and half Vulcan. Once again, I have no idea how this is dealt with in the series, but in the films, it's dealt with in an interesting manner. One thing I want to focus on is Spock's proclivity to quote Shakespeare as a way of showing his intellect and his culture. This kind of links into a lazy shorthand that art has in general, as it's overused, the idea that if they can quote Shakespeare or another accepted canonical text, it just means they are cultured, it just means they're intelligent. It's to an extent lazy characterization. It's a very recognisable trope, and it does work for the audience what it needs to do. However, it is very interesting, one, that his only text is really Hamlet, and he has like this really specific knowledge of random scenes in Hamlet. I mean, Hamlet is a great play, don't get me wrong, but Spock, get over Hamlet. But secondly, it's the choosing of Shakespeare in general. Now, I understand the need to give a human text to Spock. It shows his conflict between the Vulcan and the human. Therefore, he needs to have a human reference point. However, it is very interesting that the default view is to go to Shakespeare, that even in the 23rd century, that is the epitome of culture, that there still seems to be canonical gatekeeping around what is high culture, and it too often falls into, well, it's the things that the white British made a long time ago. This feels like a nitpick, but it's further exacerbated in Star Trek 6, which is a really good movie, and one that definitely deals with some wider conflicts that the film series otherwise ignores. There is this focus on unconscious prejudice, which I found really interesting. It's not explored as much as it could be, but there are ideas that Spock and Kirk realise they have a prejudicial view of the enemy, which is good. There is also that end of an era idea that they represent a moribund culture, that their view of the world does not fit with a more progressive society, and there are times when they accept that in a way I think is really awesome. However, I do think it drops a beat at the end when they refuse to turn in. It may be true to the characters, but it misses that thematic beat, which perhaps the series need to end with. Their time is over, and they don't fit in this new society, but they were instrumental to its success and to its creation, which could have been a really satisfying thematic point to end on. However, in this movie, you have this idea that the Klingons are presented in, as far as the films go, a different way. They are presented as cultured, and this links back to what does cultured mean in Star Trek? And it means, well, colonial values. It means British or Western exceptionalism. Now, this is shown in this banquet scene. So they're sitting around at this banquet and they're being served fine dining and fine wine. There's this idea that they can get Romulan ale, which should be banned because they are a privileged sect of society, which is worth exploring, but is for a different time. But the way it's served is fascinating. This is a society that, as I know from the films, is somewhat of like a communist utopia, which seems terrific. There is that wonderful joke in Star Trek 4 of they don't have money. However, in this banquet scene, the shots are framed so you see them being served by these gloved hands. There is still the help, there is still a serving class, and the way they are shot and framed is very colonial, it's very traditional. This idea of the gloved hand, the denying of a body and a personality, it's really weird there is this servile class here, and it definitely fits in a picture and a portrait of empire and of British colonial rule. In addition to this, the Klingons go on to show their cultural equality, so to speak, to show they are civilized. And the way they do this is by quoting a bit of Shakespeare.
To be or not to be? That is the question which preoccupies our people, Captain Kirk.
Oh, and it's Hamlet again, because it seems the writers and directors of Star Trek are only familiar with Hamlet. Again, Hamlet's great. Other Shakespeare exists, other plays exist, other literature exists, and occasionally people that aren't men and that aren't white do make literature, and it is important and valuable. Anyway, it's fascinating to me that the thing that shows a Klingon is culturally viable is their ability to recite English literature from hundreds of years ago, that they are only deemed as being cultured on this very narrow view of what cultured even means. Again, this colonialist, this canonical view of accepted homogenous culture, of a monoculture. It's also very shallow world building. It makes the universe seem much more narrow. The idea that Klingons have not achieved great works, have not achieved great literature, that they would have to conform to our standards, and that we have not, after having got to the stars and become a federation of planets, got over Shakespeare as this cultural touchstone of what it means to be intellectual, is farcical. Again, it speaks to a subconscious idea in the writers, this idea that what means intelligent is quite a colonial construct. The idea of what do we know, and the whole world is viewed through this lens. And while I feel the need to praise Star Trek, and again I really like these movies, to praise it for dealing with themes of equality and for getting involved in literature in a way that other films of this ilk do not, it's very interesting what literature they choose as valid. And to finalise this point of a colonial view of equality, I turn to the ending of Wrath of Khan, which is an emotional moment that is completely underscored by Star Trek 3, though Star Trek 3 is a lot of fun, even if you are laughing at it as much as you are laughing with it. But at the end of this, he gives this speech in which the highest praise he can give to Spock is that he is
Human.
And this echoes throughout the series, that human is used as praise repeatedly. I mean, in defence of the series, there's a really good bit in Star Trek 6 where the Klingons point out that this idea of human rights is racist, which is brilliant. That's a really worthwhile thing to note, and I wish it ran with that more.
Human rights, why the very name is racist.
And, to be fair to Spock, later when he's given human as praise, he says that that's insulting, but that's kind of framed as all grouchy old Spock. Should push on that more, because it comes down to this idea that equality is projecting your values onto somebody else. The equality of Star Trek is reimagining society in this homogenous image, and it's such a reflection of the time it was made. So, fundamentally, while I love the utopian idea of Star Trek, we must, when dealing with utopian fiction, deal with the question of utopia according to whom, and making sure that the pursuit of perfection is not just a pursuit of cultural projection.